My mother-in-law threw away my late father's ashes, claiming they were cluttering her guest room, so I called the police and had her charged with desecration. Some people think grief has an expiration date. My mother-in-law, Diane, thought 6 months was long enough for me to get over my father's death, and that his ashes were just clutter taking up space in her precious guest room. What she didn't realize was that throwing away someone's cremated remains isn't just cruel. It's a felony. And when the police showed up at her book club meeting to arrest her for desecration of human remains, she learned that some lines should never be crossed. I'm Rachel, 29, and my father passed away suddenly from a heart attack last September. Dad and I were incredibly close. He raised me as a single parent after my mom died when I was 12, and he was honestly my best friend. When he died at only 58, I was completely devastated. My husband Mark and I had been living in our own apartment, but after Dad's funeral, I couldn't handle being alone in his house going through his belongings. The grief was overwhelming, and Mark suggested we temporarily move in with his parents while I processed everything and decided what to do with Dad's property. At the time, it seemed like a reasonable solution. Mark's parents have a large house with a guest suite, and his mother Diane had always been supportive during our 3-year marriage. She said all the right things about wanting to help during my difficult time and insisted I should take as long as I needed to heal. The problem started almost immediately, but I was too deep in grief to recognize them for what they were. Diane began making comments about my emotional state and how I needed to move forward for Mark's sake. When I cried while looking through Dad's photo albums, she'd sigh dramatically and suggest I was being self-indulgent. When I wanted to visit Dad's grave on Sundays, she'd make passive-aggressive comments about how I was ruining family dinner plans. But the real issues began with Dad's ashes. I had Dad cremated because he'd always said he didn't want to take up space in a cemetery. His ashes came back in a beautiful wooden urn that I kept on the dresser in our guest room. It wasn't elaborate or huge, just a simple, elegant memorial to the most important person in my life. Diane hated that urn from day one. She never said anything directly at first, but I'd catch her staring at it with obvious distaste. She'd make comments about how morbid it was to keep ashes in a bedroom, or how it set a dark tone for the space. When I explained that having Dad's ashes nearby brought me comfort, she'd purse her lips and change the subject. 3 months after we moved in, Diane escalated her campaign against the urn. She started suggesting that I should find a more appropriate place for Dad's ashes, like a columbarium, or scattered somewhere meaningful. When I explained that I wasn't ready to make that decision yet, she accused me of wallowing in grief and said it was unhealthy to cling to death. "Rachel, honey," she said with her fake, concerned voice, "Mark is worried about you. You're not processing your grief in a healthy way. Keeping your father's ashes in our guest room is preventing you from moving forward." Mark had never expressed any concerns to me about the ashes, and when I asked him about it privately, he said his mother was putting words in his mouth. He was completely supportive of whatever I needed to do to heal. But Diane kept pushing. She'd bring up the ashes constantly, during dinner conversations, family gatherings, even in front of other people. She'd make comments about how strange it was that I talked to the urn sometimes, or how keeping ashes in a bedroom was unsanitary. The breaking point came in February, 5 months after Dad's death. I was finally starting to feel a little better and had begun making plans to clean out Dad's house and put it on the market. Diane seemed pleased that I was finally making progress, but she immediately started pressuring me about the ashes again. "Now that you're feeling better, it's time to make some decisions about your father," she announced over breakfast. "The ashes really need to find a permanent home somewhere else. The guest room is supposed to be welcoming and peaceful, not a shrine to death." I tried to explain that I still needed more time, that I wasn't ready to scatter Dad's ashes or find a permanent resting place yet. The urn brought me comfort, and as long as we were living in their house, it needed to stay with me. "Rachel, you're being unreasonable," Diane said. "It's been 5 months. You can't hold on to your father's ashes forever. It's not healthy, and frankly, it's making everyone else uncomfortable." "Everyone else?" I asked. "Who is everyone else?" "Well, Mark for one. And when we have guests, they ask questions about why there's an urn in the guest bathroom. It's awkward." I pointed out that the urn was on the dresser in our bedroom, not in the bathroom, and that if guests were uncomfortable, maybe they shouldn't be looking through our personal belongings. This was apparently the wrong thing to say, because Diane's fake concern immediately transformed into cold anger. This is our house, Rachel. We've been more than generous letting you stay here during your situation. But our generosity doesn't extend to turning our home into a funeral parlor. The ashes need to go. Mark backed me up completely when I told him about the conversation. He told his mother that the ashes would stay as long as I needed them to, and that if she had a problem with that, we'd find somewhere else to live. Diane seemed to accept this, but I could tell she was furious. For 2 weeks, there was an uncomfortable truce. Diane stopped mentioning the ashes directly, but she'd make pointed comments about respecting other people's homes and knowing when you've overstayed your welcome. The passive-aggressive atmosphere was exhausting, but I was still too emotionally fragile to deal with finding a new place to live. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Tuesday in early March. Mark was at work, and I had gone to Dad's house to continue sorting through his belongings. I'd been there for about 6 hours, going through old photo albums and packing up items to donate. It was emotionally draining work, but I was making good progress. When I got back to Diane's house around 5 p.m., something felt wrong immediately. Diane was in the kitchen preparing dinner, acting overly cheerful and asking lots of questions about my day. She seemed nervous, talking too fast and avoiding eye contact. I went upstairs to our room to change clothes and wash up for dinner. The moment I walked into the bedroom, I knew something was different. The room felt wrong somehow, like something was missing. Then I realized what it was. The urn was gone. Dad's ashes, which had sat on the dresser for 5 months, had disappeared. I checked everywhere. The closet, under the bed, the bathroom, even other rooms in the house. Nothing. The beautiful wooden urn that contained all that remained of my father had vanished completely. I ran downstairs, my heart pounding with panic and growing rage. "Diane, where is my father's urn?" I demanded. She didn't even try to deny it. "I took care of it," she said calmly, continuing to chop vegetables for dinner. "You were never going to make a decision, so I made it for you." "What do you mean you took care of it? Where are my father's ashes?" "They're gone, Rachel. I disposed of them properly. You should be thanking me for helping you move forward." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You disposed of them? Diane, what exactly did you do with my father's ashes?" "I threw them away," she said matter-of-factly, like she was discussing taking out the garbage. The urn, too. It was all very unsanitary and inappropriate. I put everything in the trash this morning, and the garbage truck already came. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I couldn't process what she'd just told me. My father's ashes, all that remained of the man who raised me, loved me, and sacrificed everything for me, were sitting in a landfill somewhere because Diane thought they were cluttering her guest room. "How could you?" I whispered, and then I was screaming. "How could you throw away my father's ashes?" "Don't be dramatic," Diane said, still acting like this was perfectly reasonable. "They were just ashes, Rachel. Your father is gone. Keeping his remains in my house wasn't going to bring him back. I did you a favor by forcing you to face reality." I called Mark immediately, sobbing and barely coherent. He left work and was home within 20 minutes. When I told him what his mother had done, he went pale with shock and horror. "Mom, please tell me you didn't actually throw away Rachel's father's ashes," he said, his voice shaking. "I did what needed to be done," Diane replied, completely unrepentant. Rachel was never going to make a decision about those ashes. They were taking up space and making everyone uncomfortable. Someone had to be the adult in this situation. Mark was furious. "Mom, those weren't your ashes to dispose of. You had no right to make that decision. This is my house, and I have every right to decide what stays and what goes. Rachel has been wallowing in grief for 5 months. It was time for some tough love." That's when I decided Diane needed to learn about consequences. I called the police. The dispatcher initially seemed confused about why I was calling about thrown-away ashes, but when I explained that someone had deliberately disposed of my father's cremated remains without permission, she said she'd send an officer to take a report. Officer Jennifer Lopez arrived about an hour later. She was professional and compassionate as I explained what had happened. When she heard that Diane had intentionally thrown away the ashes, her expression hardened. "Ma'am," she said to Diane, Did you dispose of human cremated remains that didn't belong to you? They were cluttering up my guest room, Diane replied, apparently not understanding the gravity of the situation. The girl needed to move on with her life. Officer Lopez explained that in our state, improperly disposing of human remains, even cremated remains, is a Class 4 felony punishable by up to 3 years in prison and significant fines. Desecration of human remains is taken very seriously by law enforcement. I didn't desecrate anything, Diane protested. I just threw away some ashes that were taking up space. Ma'am, cremated human remains are still legally considered human remains. Throwing them in the garbage without proper authorization is desecration under state law. Diane finally seemed to understand that she might be in real trouble. But I didn't know it was illegal. I was just trying to help my daughter-in-law move forward. Officer Lopez was not sympathetic. Ignorance of the law isn't a defense, ma'am, and disposing of someone else's family member's remains without permission shows a shocking lack of judgment. Diane was arrested that evening and charged with desecration of human remains and improper disposal of a dead body. She spent the night in jail before Mark bailed her out the next morning. But I wasn't done with her yet. While researching the legal ramifications of what Diane had done, I discovered that our state also has specific laws about funeral fraud and abuse of a corpse that carry additional penalties. I contacted the district attorney's office and provided detailed documentation of Diane's actions and her complete lack of remorse. I also learned that the landfill where our neighborhood's garbage is taken keeps detailed records of what comes from which trucks and when. There was a small possibility that Dad's ashes could be recovered if we acted quickly. The landfill search was heartbreaking and ultimately unsuccessful. We spent 2 days with a recovery team looking through the section where Tuesday's garbage from our neighborhood would have been dumped. We found the wooden urn, cracked and damaged, but the ashes had scattered and mixed with tons of other waste. The sight of Dad's beautiful urn, broken and covered in garbage, was almost worse than losing the ashes themselves. Diane had taken something sacred and meaningful and literally thrown it away like trash. The criminal case against Diane moved forward quickly. The prosecutor said it was one of the most callous acts of disrespect for human remains she'd ever seen, especially given that Diane showed no remorse and continued to justify her actions. But the real justice came when Diane's arrest became public knowledge. Our local newspaper picked up the story. Local woman arrested for throwing away daughter-in-law's father's ashes. The article included details about how Diane had disposed of the remains because they were cluttering her guest room and how she'd shown no remorse for her actions. The story went viral on social media. Diane's full name was in the article, and people were sharing it everywhere with comments about what a horrible person she was. Her church group, book club, and social circles all saw exactly what kind of person they'd been associating with. Diane had always cared deeply about her reputation and social standing. She'd spent years cultivating an image as a pillar of the community, involved in charity work, active in her church, known for her hospitality and kindness. All of that was destroyed overnight. The day before her court appearance, Diane called me crying and begging me to drop the charges. She promised to pay for a memorial service, to help me create a new tribute to Dad, to do anything to make it right. "Rachel, please," she sobbed over the phone. "I made a terrible mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. Please don't let them send me to prison over this." "You weren't thinking clearly," I replied. "Diane, you threw my father's ashes in the garbage and told me I should thank you for it. You showed no remorse until you realized you might face consequences." I know, I was wrong. But please, think about Mark. Think about our family. Don't destroy our lives over this. You destroyed my father's remains and called it a favor. You don't get to ask for mercy now. Diane ultimately pled guilty to desecration of human remains and was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 months. She also had to pay $10,000 in fines and restitution. The judge was particularly harsh in his sentencing remarks. "Mrs. Patterson, your actions show a shocking disregard for human dignity and the grieving process. You took it upon yourself to dispose of human remains that belong to someone else, and you've shown no genuine remorse for the pain you've caused. This sentence reflects the seriousness of your crime and serves as a warning that such callous behavior will not be tolerated." Mark and I moved out of his parents' house immediately after Diane's arrest. We found our own apartment and started rebuilding our lives away from his toxic family dynamic. Mark's father blamed me for overreacting and said I was vindictive for pressing charges, but Mark supported me completely. The hardest part was accepting that Dad's ashes were truly gone. I'd held on to hope that somehow we might recover them, but the reality was that they were lost forever in a landfill because one selfish woman decided they were inconvenient. I created a memorial garden in our new apartment's patio area, with plants that Dad would have loved, and a small plaque with his photo and favorite quote. It's not the same as having his ashes, but it's a peaceful place where I can remember him and feel close to his memory. Diane was released from prison after serving 13 months. She immediately moved to another state to live with her sister, unable to face the judgment and social isolation she experienced in our community. Her arrest and conviction had made her a pariah among her former friends and social groups. Mark occasionally gets updates about his mother from relatives, but we have no direct contact with her. She sent one letter after her release, apologizing again and asking for forgiveness, but some actions can't be forgiven. She didn't just throw away ashes. She threw away the last physical connection I had to my father. Some people think I was too harsh in pressing criminal charges. They say Diane was just trying to help in her own misguided way, and that sending her to prison was excessive punishment for a mistake. But what Diane did wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated act of cruelty designed to force me to move on according to her timeline. She knew exactly how much those ashes meant to me, and she threw them away anyway because she prioritized her guest room aesthetics over my grief. The law exists to protect human remains from exactly this kind of desecration. Diane learned that there are serious consequences for treating other people's loved ones like garbage, literally and figuratively. I don't regret pressing charges. Dad deserved better than being thrown away like trash, and I deserved better than being told to be grateful for it. Diane made her choice when she decided my father's remains were clutter, and I made mine when I decided she should face the consequences. The experience taught me that grief doesn't follow other people's timelines, and that some boundaries are absolute. You don't get to decide when someone else's mourning period is over, and you definitely don't get to dispose of their loved one's remains without consequences. Diane thought she was teaching me a lesson about moving forward. Instead, she learned a lesson about respecting other people's grief and the legal protection of human remains. Sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is to make sure the person who disrespected them faces justice. Dad would have been proud of me for standing up to Diane's bullying and making sure she couldn't hurt anyone else the same way. The ashes may be gone, but Dad's memory lives on in the love I carry for him and the strength he gave me to fight for what's right. And Diane will forever be known as the woman who went to prison for throwing away her daughter-in-law's father's ashes. Some legacies are worth preserving. Others serve as warnings.